Hello, we're here with Elder Eloy Martinez. Hello, Elder, how are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you so much for talking to us today. Could you tell us a little bit about where you came from, what your tribal affiliation is, and how you grew up?
I came from a place called Piedras Amarillas in Colorado, and it was close to, it was kind of maybe pretty close. This little ranch my grandma owned, and she had a bunch of sheep. She had her own, her own sheep, her own supply of wool. She did all her own weaving and stuff like that. I still got rugs in the house that she made. But anyway, that was, she was her name was Emilia Trujillo. She was Apache, and my grandfather's name was Eleuterio, and he was part Navajo.
This was
So
from your mother's side or your father's side?
my my mother's side was Navajo. My grandmother's was Apache, and then the other part was probably indigenous from Colorado because they'd been there forever. They never crossed the border. The border crossed us actually. No, not us down here closer, but up there they had from the first days that the I guess after the conquerors got there, my grandma had already had her place, and then when they started fencing everything off, the Texans came in with longhorn sheep, longhorn steers, cows. So they wanted to get rid of all the sheep because the sheep would eat the grass all the way down to the root. So there's a lot of conflict, and that's when we first found out how the tax system worked.
This was when? In 19 when?
This was probably in 1930s,
Yeah.
1940s. I was born in 1940, so it was probably in the 40s that's when they first started coming out with the property taxes and all that other stuff. And then people didn't know about it.
In Colorado?
Yeah,
They didn't have property taxes before 1940?
they might have. I don't remember.
Oh,
Whenever they,
okay.
I know whenever they started. I can't remember. That's something but I know that that's how the Texans acquired most of that property because people weren't aware that they were supposed to pay taxes,
Oh,
and so if after a year you don't pay your tax, they put it on the block, just like they do here,
yeah.
and they sell it. And you don't, if you're not aware of it, you think you're good, and all of a sudden somebody shows up and says, "Hey, you got to leave. This is my land."
Oh, they did that to the land as well.
That's what they did on the land. That's how they got all that land up there. That's how they got the ranch my grandmother had.
Oh,
Same way,
so she lost her ranch?
Yeah, not way after she died, But for my uncles, they never took care of business either, but they didn't know any different. Most of them never had any. They stayed away from college and from schools and stuff because they all figured every time somebody went to a school, it was like they got indoctrinated. And they talked about their history, and that's what they wanted to teach you, and that wasn't the way that they wanted to respond to it. Uh,
So
anyway, they got the property, and then we moved to a coal mining town called Big Four. They had four big coal mines in there. It was company-owned town.
Was that in Colorado too?
Yeah, this is in Colorado.
How old were you when you moved?
Probably about maybe 5, 6.
Yeah.
And we lived in one of the houses there, and those houses are right where right in the middle of the mines. Kind of like we lived in this mine, the smell and all the dust and stuff.
Do you know what they
Twice
were mining?
Coal,
Coal.
and but twice a week they'd come in and hose the houses down, and the water would run black.
That's how much coal dust there was?
Yeah.
And you were inhaling all of that as a child?
That's where black lung come from. A lot of my uncles, they all worked in the mine. All the ones that worked in the mine got black lung until the miners, after they had a strike in Colorado called the Ludlow Massacre. Miners went out on strike and they came and shot them down. And I think that's probably the first time they used armored vehicles on the back of a train. They shot a bunch of the miners down. So there's a lot of history around Colorado. Sand Creek, another place that happened in Colorado. There's just a lot of histories, and there's a lot. And plus, in Colorado, back when the colonizers first got here, and even before, some of the warring tribes, like the Navajo and the Southern Ute, a lot of these tribes are fierce, and they would take kids and they would sell kids to other tribes. They would trade the kids off for maybe a horse or whatever. So there's a lot of intermingling of different tribes. That's how a lot
So
of
this
tribes.
is before the Europeans got there. The tribes were selling kids to each
Well,
other?
they trade them.
Okay,
You know,
trading. Yeah.
but they figure as long as they weren't there, they didn't have to fight them over here. They trade them over here. Well, I don't know,
I see.
but that's kind of like a lot of them were called criados. Like basically what they did for their keep, they did what they had to do to.
Yeah,
They're like mini servants.
I see.
But a lot of them, because the families being like they are, just took them in as their own. They intermarried with the people, and so you consequently there's where the mestizo part comes in.
Ah,
See, so a lot of Colorado people call themselves mestizo, instead of indigenous and all that other. And then I went.
what does mestizo mean?
Mix,
Of whom?
mix
Of
of races,
of all types of
Indian
people?
race, yeah.
Okay.
Whatever, if you're mixed, it's a mestizo.
But if you're mixed with a European, is that also a mestizo?
Yeah.
Okay.
And still, you still have blood that you're got native blood.
Okay. So a native person mixed with any other person is a mestizo?
Pretty much. I think more they call them now mixed bloods, but back then they used the term mestizo more for Indian people and Mexican people, brown people.
Okay.
You know, but that whole history of the genocide and all the stuff that they did, it was, you could up until even 50s, 40s, 50s, all that was really bad for people, Indian people. That's when they called it the drunken Indian period and all that other stuff. Because a lot of people, they got hooked on alcohol and, they weren't able to hunt, they weren't able to do the things they did before. It's a lot of idle time on your hands and depression. And I'm sure all those things that, that are still happening today. Like look at what's happening right now. If somebody wants to say, I own it, and that's not even cool, but that's where we're headed if we don't watch out.
Yeah. So when you were a child, you were in this mining town.
Yeah.
You
We
moved there
lived-
when you were 6 or
We
7.
lived there until the mines closed, and then.
So your uncles were working in the mine?
Yeah. all my
What did your
uncles-
grandmother do?
She still had her little.
She still had her.
She had her little ranch. She kept her ranch until after she died. And
I
one
see.
of my oldest uncles took over it, and all the younger people didn't want to stay there anymore. It was just like just
Yeah.
making ends meet. I was always every year you was going deeper in debt, like that mine song says.
Yeah.
And
Did you go to school?
yeah, I went to. I was actually in school in Piedras San Marias when my dad worked in the mines, because they commute to the mines. It's only about 9 miles from where we live. So they would commute before we moved into the mining camps. And during that time, they had a little schoolhouse that had K through 12 in school, all the classes. They weren't separated. It was just one room schoolhouse, little schoolhouse, probably maybe about 14, 15 students.
So you
So-
weren't taken away to a boarding school?
No.
Okay.
I
Well,
never-
were there still boarding schools at the time?
Oh, yeah.
But how
They didn't call them boarding schools in Colorado. They called them children's homes.
children's homes? How come you escaped it? How did you escape it?
I didn't. I went to the other institutions, the incarceration type.
Can you explain a bit more?
Well, when I was like, anyway, I went to the school, the little school,
Yeah.
and I was lucky because I got to learn a lot of stuff that I wouldn't have been able to learn because I was in that classroom. And I not only learned the kindergarten stuff, I learned the other stuff right along with the other ones. So by the time I got into regular school, they advanced me one class in regular school because I was ahead of. I knew how to read, I knew how to spell, I knew how to do math, I knew a lot of the stuff that the older kids, their stuff looked more interesting. So I was ahead there. But then after we moved after the mining camp closed down, things got really hard. There was no work, And my father and a couple of his friends decided that they would start getting even with the colonizers, and so they started killing their cows. They go out there and wrestle their cows and feed the people.